Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into the incredibly complex and, let's be honest, often totally misunderstood mechanics behind pharmaceutical economics. We're talking about a world of massive numbers, fierce legal battles, and, of course, life-saving science. My goal here is to really break down exactly how this industry operates. We're going to look purely at the economic engine that actually drives the whole thing. So let's kick things off with a pretty staggering number, 5,000%. You might remember back in 2015, this hedge fund manager, Martin Shkreli, acquired the rights to a decades-old anti-parasitic drug. He then turned around and raised its price from $13.50 all the way to $750, literally overnight. I mean, a 5,000% price hike for a pill that had been around for decades? Naturally, the public outrage was massive. But here's the absolute essential takeaway for us. That wasn't a glitch in the matrix. It wasn't some weird loophole. It was actually just the pharmaceutical system laid completely bare, stripped of its usual polite camouflage. He simply restricted distribution so generic competitors couldn't test the drug. And to understand how on earth that's even possible, we really have to look at how the entire industry functions from the ground up. To figure out where all that money goes, we're going to map out the life cycle of a drug's profitability through 5 key stages. First up, why the pill isn't the product. Second, the incredibly high cost of failure. Third, building the patent wall. Fourth, middlemen and the whole rebate trap. And finally, surviving the generic cliff. All right, let's jump right into section 1. The pill isn't the product. We really need to shatter a super common illusion about what it is you're actually buying when you step up to the pharmacy counter. We naturally tend to think we're paying for physical chemistry, right? The actual ingredients mixed together in a lab. But honestly, the pill itself is really just a delivery mechanism. The actual product, the true asset being bought, sold, aggressively defended in court, and lobbied for, is a legally enforced, temporary right to be the sole seller of something people absolutely, desperately need. It's a temporary legal monopoly. To really see the gap between physical chemistry and these legal monopolies, let's look at Humira. It's a genuinely revolutionary drug for rheumatoid arthritis and Crohn's disease. Now, the raw manufacturing cost for a whole year's course of treatment, that sits somewhere around $300 to $500. Pretty reasonable, right? But thanks to its monopoly status, the price bill to the U.S. healthcare system for that exact same year of treatment has approached $80,000. I mean, that is roughly 160 times the manufacturing cost. That is not your standard retail markup. That is a massive chasm created entirely by market exclusivity. But here's the catch. That monopoly is strictly limited. A U.S. patent lasts 20 years. And sure, that sounds like a long runway, but it's actually a countdown clock. And the clock starts the very moment the patent is filed. That's usually in the early stage discovery phase, way before human trials even begin. So because the intense scientific gauntlet of clinical testing and FDA approval can easily burn through 8 to 13 years of that window, a company usually only has maybe 7 to 12 years of actual commercial exclusivity left by the time the drug finally hits the market. Which brings us perfectly to section 2, the high cost of failure. Let's look at how this rapidly shrinking time frame creates this immense, almost unimaginable pressure to maximize profits during that super short window. The crucial point to grasp here is the absolutely staggering failure rate of the R&D funnel. Picture this. You start with 10,000 chemical compounds synthesized in a lab. Out of those 10,000, maybe 10 actually make it into early human testing. Then, just 3 survive to the next phase, and maybe 1.5 make it to mass global trials. Ultimately, only 1 single drug reaches approval. Let that sink in for a second. 9 out of 10 compounds that make it to human testing are going to fail. This means that 1 single successful drug has to carry the massive financial burden for all the failures that came before it. Factoring in those profound failure rates, plus the whole decade of tied-up capital that investors basically forfeit while waiting, academic researchers at Tufts University estimate the true cost of bringing just 1 new, successful drug to market sits right around $2.5 billion. $2.5 billion. Even the most conservative estimates put it close to $1 billion. It is, without a doubt, an industry where a colossal failure is just the statistical default. Yet, despite absorbing all these massive scientific risks, and honestly sometimes multi-billion-dollar litigation settlements like Merck had with Vioxx, pharmaceutical companies don't operate on razor-thin margins like, say, your local grocery store. Actually, they act a lot more like venture capital funds. By leveraging these asymmetric blockbuster wins, where a single drug can bring in over $10 billion a year, pharmaceutical companies routinely secure the highest operating margins in the entire global economy.
We're talking typically between 25 and 45%. They easily beat out software giants, automakers, airlines, and yeah, they leave the 1 to 3% margins of grocery chains completely in the dust.
Moving right along to Section 3, building the patent wall. So if a single blockbuster drug funds the entire pipeline and generates those incredible margins, how exactly does a company protect it as that countdown clock ticks down? Well, they definitely don't just rely on the original chemical patent. Instead, they construct what lawyers actually call a patent thicket. Think of it like a massive legal fortress built not just around the core molecule itself, but around all the secondary elements. They're patenting the specific tablet coating, the precise dosing schedule, or even the plastic auto-injector pen the drug comes in. Looking back at Humira, it's honestly pretty astonishing to see that nearly 90% of their roughly 130 active patents were filed long after the drug was already approved and already generating billions of dollars. So this wasn't about funding new early-stage research at all, right? This was a deliberate, hyper-aggressive fortification tactic. And you know what? It worked. While cheaper alternatives called biosimilars hit the European market in 2018, this massive patent wall successfully locked out U.S. generic competitors until 2023. That secured them an extra 5 years of tens of billions in annual revenue. Now for Section 4, middlemen and the rebate trap. You might naturally think that patients just pay the manufacturer directly for these heavily protected drugs. But as we'll see, that's almost never actually the case. Between the drug manufacturer and the patient is this really complicated web that creates what the industry calls the gross-to-net bubble. So you have the really loud public list price, the shocking sticker price you always hear about on the news. But then you have the quiet, private net price, which is what the manufacturer actually keeps after all the closed-door negotiations are done. Because of this bizarre bubble, a drug company can actually raise a drug's public list price while the actual revenue they take home per pill stays entirely flat. It's completely counterintuitive. So who exactly is capturing that gap? Well, the real leverage in this system is held by middlemen, known as pharmacy benefit managers or PBMs. Just 3 of these companies control over 80% of the U.S. market. They have the power to dictate which medicines actually get covered by insurance. And bizarrely enough, PBMs often favor drugs with higher list prices. Why? Because a higher sticker price means a larger rebate pool for them to negotiate, and naturally take a slice from. The really tragic side effect of this twisted incentive structure is that uninsured patients, or folks on high-deductible plans, are often cruelly left to pay that fully inflated list price out of their own pockets, completely missing out on any of those negotiated discounts. Let's move into our final act, Section 5. Surviving the generic cliff. So what exactly happens the day that temporary legal monopoly finally expires and that 20-year countdown clock hits 0? In short, it happens brutally fast. The very moment a standard small molecule drug loses its exclusivity, cheap generic competition absolutely floods the market. Because these generic companies don't have to pay for that initial billion-dollar discovery phase, they can compete entirely on price. This typically wipes out 80 to 95% of the brand's revenue within a matter of months. Now, biologics, which are complex drugs grown in living cells, face a slightly softer landing, just because they're way harder to copy. But even then, their revenue drops 30 to 50%. It is a terrifying, catastrophic financial cliff for these companies. But obviously, a slower drop isn't the same as being totally safe. These pharmaceutical giants will use literally every tactic available to ensure that revenue cliff never arrives on schedule. They use evergreening, basically tweaking a formula from, say, twice a day to once a day, just to secure a fresh patent. They use product hopping to aggressively steer patients over to new patented versions before the old ones expire. They even do pay for delay, where they actually pay generic challengers to just hold off on launching. And increasingly, rather than take on that super risky early-stage research themselves, they just write massive checks, like Pfizer paying $43 billion for Seagen. They basically just buy up smaller biotechs that have already proven a drug works. They're buying certainty to replace their expiring pipelines. However, the single biggest threat to this entire economic model over the next decade might not actually be rival companies at all. It might just be the government that granted the monopolies in the first place. See, for most of its history, the U.S. refused to directly negotiate drug prices. But the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act changed all of that, equipping Medicare with brand new powers to negotiate prices directly on top spending drugs. This major shift is already forcing companies to rapidly rethink and adjust their global launch strategies and their entire development pipelines. As we look at the big picture of this incredibly complex ecosystem, we really have to impartially hold two contrasting truths at the exact same time. Yes, this system absolutely creates expensive, deeply fortified monopolies that are designed to extract maximum profit. There is no denying that. But those exact same massive financial incentives, the promise of those huge blockbuster margins, well, those are precisely what drive the terrifyingly risky research that continues to save millions of human lives around the globe every single year. The premium pricing and the miraculous cures, they are born from the exact same economic engine. Which brings us to the final, somewhat provocative question that I want you to take away from this explainer today. You now know that you are never just buying a chemical in a bottle, you're buying a countdown clock. The entire global industry is fundamentally predicated on those limited, highly profitable windows. So if regulators continue to shrink that window and aggressively chip away at their pricing power, the whole model has to adapt. So what actually happens to the future of global medicine when the economics of innovation fundamentally change? It's a fascinating puzzle, and honestly, it's one we're all going to be living through in real time. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking